It's a pleasure to be together again at the start of a great morning, and it is my honor and pleasure to introduce to you Professor Keith Moxey, who is the first speaker of the morning, and his talk is titled, "What Time is Tomorrow?" As you will have noticed by now, we have a whole thread running through thinking about time and temporality and the questions of anticipation. And I thought that no one would be more suitable to the task of orienting us temporally this morning than no one would be more suitable than Professor Keith Moxey. Just to introduce him briefly, he was born in Buenos Aires, Argentina, and he's the author of several books on the historiography and philosophy of art history and on 16th century painting, including the practice of persuasion, politics, and paradox in art history, the practice of theory, post-structuralism, cultural politics, and art history, peasants, warriors, and wives, popular imaginary and Reformation, and Peter Artensen, Joachim Büchler, and the rise of secular painting in the context of Reformations. Professor Moxey is also co-editor of several publications such as Art History, Historical Objects in Contemporary Perspectives, and Visual Culture, Images and Interpretations. He has been professor at Tufts University and the University of Virginia, a scholar of Renaissance art in Northern Europe, and a student of the historiography and philosophy of art history. He has lectured and taught widely in the United States and abroad. Since 1988, he's professor and chair of art history at Barnard College, New York. Professor Moxey, welcome.
Primeramente quiero agradecer a los organizadores de este encuentro, especialmente a María Bostock y a Melissa Mota, quien me han facilitado el viaje y mi estadía en esta ciudad. También agradezco a Sengupta por su invitación a participar en una conferencia que he encontrado fascinante hasta ahora. Ojalá que siga así. Cuando pensamos el tiempo, tenemos la tendencia de pensar en términos universales, pero el tiempo no se distingue fácilmente del espacio, del lugar en donde ocurre. Relaciones del poder, desigualdades económicas, tecnológicas, militares, animan el tiempo del mismo modo que animan las relaciones políticas entre distintos países y pueblos. ¿Dónde se encuentra la contemporaneidad? ¿Dónde se encontrará el futuro? ¿Cuáles son las naciones cuyas ideologías culturales dominarán nuestra concepción de lo que pasa en nuestro tiempo? ¿Se encontrará en Nueva York, en Londres, París, Berlín, quizás en Nairobi, Abu Dhabi, Delhi, Bangkok o Shanghai? Es una ilusión creer que vivimos en un mundo donde el tiempo se desarrolla a la misma velocidad en todas partes. Esta charla enfoca los problemas creados por nuestra nueva conciencia de la heterocronía, que hay tiempos distintos que pertenecen a distintas naciones y pueblos. Por eso el título de mi charla es ¿Cuál es el tiempo de mañana? Tengo ahora que disculparme. Siento mucho no poder dar esta conferencia en español. No domino el idioma suficientemente bien para traducir ideas filosóficas y un argumento bastante abstracto, pero por otra parte estoy contento de tratar de encontrar respuestas a las preguntas que podrían surgir al final de esta sesión. So I'm very sorry I have to speak in English, since most of my life has been spent in English-speaking countries. So this paper, and I'll try to speak slowly and thank the translator for her kind intervention here. This paper is taken from a book it's called Visual Time, which is currently in press. It has two main axes of interpretation of the visual arts. It's proposing that time is an important consideration in our understanding of what is visual. And it focuses on two themes. One of them is heterochrony. In other words, by heterochrony I mean several different times, that there is a multiplicity of times. And I think anybody interested in contemporary art is very much aware of the different times with which we are confronted. Contemporary art takes place in Africa, in China, in Asia. It takes place all over the world in a way that was unforeseen a generation ago. So heterochrony, different times, a multiplicity of times. The other theme might be called autochrony, the capacity of artistic events, and by this I mean works, I mean, constructions, performances and so on, create their own time. That the work of art has the capacity to create its own time. So these are two principles then, one that I want to talk about. One of them is about the multiplicity of time, and the other one, how works of art tend to have the capacity to create their own time. Okay, so you're all familiar with the idea that time is a construction, an invention, which depends on human ingenuity for its various definitions. We often forget, though, that time is a concept also shaped by power relations. In the wake of modernism, and in the context of a post-colonial awareness that time does not flow at the same speed in all places, the location of time's occurrence has become much more problematic. Where is time taking place? Does it take place in New York, or does it take place in Dakar? This talk explores the dilemmas offered to historical writing by the current difficulty of determining where time might actually be. So you can see the difficulties. I'm an art historian. You can see the difficulties that are presented to the art historian trying to deal with contemporary art. For example, how is this a period, or if it is a period, then where is this period taking place? So these are the problems. So this is the problem that I want to try to address. Perhaps the greatest difficulty in conceiving the historical nature of the contemporary, let alone the future, lies not so much in our ever-increasing awareness of the speed of events and the instantaneity of communications in an age of the internet, as in the difficulty of coming to terms with the asynchrony, the non-synchronous nature of temporal developments. In a post-colonial world, if we recognize that time has different values in different locations, it is difficult to select one dimension or another of that multiplicity as that which is characteristic of a particular period, say the contemporary. I mean, which of these forms of time are we going to select to call the contemporary and insert it into our notion of history? On what grounds can diverse temporal schemes be reduced to an account that privileges only one of them? Can synchrony be reconciled with asynchrony, one time with many, or does this maneuver result in a contradiction, an insurmountable obstacle to any future prospect of what we might call a universal history? This is a problem then for historians of the future, but historians of the present as well. To be more direct, the non-synchronic quality of the passage of time cannot be squared with the ongoing need for historical narrative. How, for example, can we sacrifice the rich complexity of a historical moment for an abbreviated and reductive narrative of events? This is the dilemma. A rising awareness of time's multiplicity has absorbed so this section now is trying to review the dimensions of the problem and how people have dealt with it. Rising awareness of the multiplicity has absorbed the attention of a number of historians and art critics. And can you hear me? Is this all right? Nobody's complaining? Yeah, okay. Yes, you can hear me? Or no, you can't? Okay, all right. Okay, so a number of people have been dealing with this issue. I'm hardly the first one to have stumbled across it. There was an exhibition in London, for example, a few years ago at the Tate Modern, curated by Nicolas Bourriaud. Nicolas Bourriaud, the curator of the Alter Modern exhibition, argues that the postmodern is over and that we find ourselves in a moment that he dubs alter modern, a term to be understood as a moment rather than a period, for it bears no relation to the past. Alter modern, then, as a sort of other modern, something that is uncannily removed from any relation to the past that preceded it. A characteristic of the now is its heterochrony, a vision, then I quote him, a vision of human history as constituted by multiple temporalities. Bourriaud's position seeks to avoid the teleological implications, that is, the implications of a linear history of art, a history that might be leading to an end, that have so often marked past efforts at periodization. In other words, people trying to create the notion of the period have often placed them in a sequence. You know, you have antiquity, the Renaissance, the Baroque, the 19th century, modernity, contemporaneity, modern, postmodern, and then what? And then everybody seems to really hesitate as to what to call what happens then. Rather than envision a proliferation of histories, one for each of time's distinct manifestations, Bourriaud assumes that contemporaneity is ahistorical, that history has somehow disappeared. Heterochronicity in these terms translates into achronicity. There is no time. The multitude of time's rivers, its many forms, and the potential difficulty of fording them is interpreted as equivalent to time's absence. Evading the lure of universal time, this strategy nevertheless deliberately fails to engage with the possibility that time possesses many dimensions and textures. The heterochronous trajectories traversed by different cultures are rejected in terms in favor of a non-time that flattens and obliterates the specificities of geographical and cultural location. So you can see what's sacrificed here. It does justice to the fact that time is not going anywhere, since time has come to an end. On the other hand, it flattens any effort at difference, to suggest the differences of different moments, The trouble with arguing that there are no differences in time is it tends also to flatten any differences in cultures. That it doesn't, that the equation of time and space doesn't matter. Okay, if we are to treat either the contemporary or the future historically, the multiplicity of time must somehow be narrativized. So how are we going to do this? How are we going to narrativize these moments that seem so different one from the other that they deserve recognition? The heterochronic nature of the world's cultures, including their incoherencies and incommensurabilities, however, can only be articulated through reference to some common denominator. What might that common denominator be? What might be what we might call the dominant time? In the present context, it would be disingenuous not to recognize the presence of a dominant time system, that put in place during the colonial period. It's not for nothing that we call something, the longitude from which all the time zones are registered is called Greenwich Mean Time. There was a big battle in the 19th century between Paris and London. Where was the longitude from which all the time zones were going to be calculated? Where was it? Where did it run? So they found it ran through Greenwich, which is just outside of London. Okay, the distinction between the colonizers and the colonized, so often marked by race, served to reinforce the sense of superiority of the white adventurers whose economic and technological and military might ruled the world. Such attitudes were further confirmed by the philosophical ideas of the late 18th century, the Age of Enlightenment, as Eri Kamara reminded us yesterday, where an epistemological system, a system of knowledge, based on ideas of rigorous objectivity, guaranteed an insatiable desire to know, and thus to control, the world and everything in it. It has, as a consequence, proven relatively easy for European and American scholars involved in the study of modern and contemporary art to ignore art produced in cultures outside the West. The history of modernism was the history of 19th century in France and in the United States. And you look at the survey books, some of my colleagues produced a book called Art Since 1900, and you would not know from that book that there was art being produced anywhere outside of Western Europe and the United States. The suppressed narratives that fell out of time as a consequence of the institutionalization of colonial time offer us, historians that is, boundless possibilities. Not only are many of these histories still to be written, but their relation to one another, as well as to the dominant story of modernity, remains to be told. Writing about contemporary art of Eastern Europe, for example, the Polish scholar Piotr Piotrowski describes the situation as follows. I quote him here. The center provides the canon, the hierarchy of values and the stylistic norms. It is the role of the periphery to adopt them in the process of reception. It may happen, of course,
that the periphery has its own outstanding artists, but their recognition, their concentration, their consecration in art history depends on the center, on the exhibitions organized in the West and in books published in Western countries. Okay, so back to the problem. What are we going to do about this situation? How are people looking at it? So Nicolas Bourriaud is one. Terry Smith's recent book, What is Contemporary Art, is perhaps the most ambitious attempt to date to think through the historical issues raised by contemporary art, by the discreditation of the linear conceptions of historical time. Smith's view agree with those articulated by Bourriaud in doubting whether the contemporary can or should be treated like a period. And here I quote again. This is Terry Smith. No longer does it feel like our time, because our cannot stretch to encompass its contrariness, nor indeed is it a time, because if the modern was inclined above all to define itself as a period and sort the past into periods, in contemporaneity, periodization is impossible. The only potentially permanent thing about this state of affairs is that it may last for an unspecifiable amount of time. The present may become perversely eternal. Let me just cite that again. The present may become perversely eternal. Is this what's going to happen to the future? Is the future simply going to be exactly like what's happening today? Is there no point to understanding that there are differences in the passage of time? I guess that's the main problem. Like Bourriaud, Smith wishes to avoid what he perceives as the essentializing dangers inherent in the period of periodization. In other words, the essentializing goes along with making a period. If you have a period, you have to characterize it. You have to define it. You have to say, these are the characteristics of the Baroque, these are the characteristics of the medieval period, these are the characteristics of antiquity, and so on. So he argues that a contemporary art is just too diverse and to describe or to categorize in any way. Contemporaneity is marked by the impossibility of its definition, a historical moment that is identified by irreconcilable antinomies. The unconscious irony of this position is that it replaces one essentialism for another. For if periodization depends on the identification and identification of particular temporal characteristics, so does the idea of an atemporal void, a non-time. While Smith's argument constitutes a dramatic challenge to the evolutionary theory of history and expresses a widespread and legitimate dissatisfaction with its failure to do justice to historical experience, it also asserts that history has come to an end, and that the narrative structure on which the attribution of meaning to the past has depended is no longer relevant. An attack on the inherent essentialism of narrativity, however, cuts both ways. In negating the legitimacy of a hegemonic concept of time, the argument also denies meaning to all systems of time and their attendant narratives, many of which has been traditionally marginalized. In eliminating universal time, this perspective not only eliminates difference among moments in time, but also the possibility that there might be other ways of telling time. A featureless contemporaneity registers neither difference in time nor culture. Okay, so what are we going to do about it? In contrast to the desire to marshal the contemporary, to dispense with the necessity for periodization altogether, an enduring compulsion to understand the contemporary as a period, as an art historical moment, for example, that succeeds modernism and postmodernism remains. If the contemporary as a period is incorporated into an evolutionary narrative identified with modernism, however, it simply becomes another stage in a familiar but discredited story, privileging the present and all of the cultures and that of the cultures that dominate the international scene as the place at the end of time from which all other moments can be calibrated and evaluated, extends the historicist structure of understanding of the past by implying that the present fulfills the historical development. This is the perpetual danger of historicism. If you have a developmental, a linear system, you're always at the end of time and apparently see more clearly than any other person in history. Okay. So, like historical writing of the 19th and the 20th centuries, the contemporary becomes the latest place from whose exalted perspective it is possible to discern the workings of the Hegelian spirit. Narrative, the rhetorical form to which historical writing belongs, seems to insist that the present cannot be conceived as a period without being incorporated into a story that has a beginning, a middle, and an end. If chronology relies on an ideological agenda, then the power relations on which it depends cannot be overlooked. It's really what I've been trying to emphasize so far, that there is an ideology behind this thing called universal time. No longer believing that Western contemporaneity enjoys a privileged position in the progressive sequence of historical periods, its post-modern condition nevertheless searches for some way to understand its own situation. So now what? What other forms of time can we turn to in order to give temporal meaning to works of art? Perhaps and here this is a big intersection in this talk, so I'm moving from the description and argument about one form of time to think about another form of time. Perhaps the very materiality of culture, the physical vestiges of times past, with their demand for a perceptual and cognitive response from the viewer, prompts us to another way of thinking about the issue of periodization. George Kubler, whose wonderful book, The Shape of Time, you're probably familiar with, undoubtedly the most poetic historian to recognize, most poetic historian to tangle with these issues of temporality. He once wrote, and I quote here, "The cultural clock runs mainly on the ruined fragments of matter recovered from refuse heaps and graveyards, from abandoned cities and buried villages. For any study of the visual, the traces and tracks of time's existence are located in artifacts. Many, if not all such objects, of course, have long been ascribed an aesthetic and ontological presence that prevents them from nestling securely within epistemological systems." What I mean is works of art have this capacity, this tendency to break time. They insist on our appreciating them and coming to terms with them in a way that seems to fall out of time. They intimate something in excess of the entirely comprehensible, something that language cannot capture. Even if images serve as records of the time and place of their creation, they also appeal to the senses and possess an effective force that allows them to attract attention in temporal and cultural locations far from the historical horizons in which they were created. The phenomenological tradition of art history, and by phenomenology I'm really referring to an important philosophical tradition associated with the name Martin Heidegger, perhaps more than any other. Phenomenological tradition of art history has always insisted that the visual artifact can create its own history. Arguing that images call for attention and demand interpretation, several recent thinkers have developed the concept of anachronism as a means of describing the process of mediation that goes on between artifacts that both solicit an effective response and invite the desire of the contemporary historian or critic to make meaning. So, anachronism, in other words, exploiting the breaks in time, acknowledging that there's something other than linear time, that time can be told anachronically, literally out of place. Anachronism is usually treated as a vice. If as a historian, it's the worst thing you can possibly do. I'm advocating here, I'm suggesting, as so many other contemporary theorists are doing, that anachronism has a lot going for it. By emphasizing the contemporaneity of their response to images, by folding the historicity of their own temporal locations within accounts of historical horizons, such scholars effectively disrupt any absolute distinction between past and present. In weaving what has been with what is, they often offer us a different conception of time, no longer dominated by a linear progression, the linear progression with which art history is so familiar, but one that instead erases the distinction between the observer on one side of time and the age in which the work was created on the other. The texture of the past is threaded through an account of the work's reception in the present. History is recognized as an attempt to grasp the otherness of temporal distance in the full recognition of the impossibility of ever doing so. Disabused of any pretension of offering an objective account of the past, historical writing of this kind affirms the presence of the past in the present as well as of the past in the present. The presence of the present in the past as well as the past in the present. If how am I doing here? Okay, this won't take much longer. If the work of art carries its own time, or has the power to create time in the response of those who receive it, then how is it to be narrativized? How are we to tell stories, turn the visual into text? I mean, the visual always escapes the text. There's always a war between the two. But nevertheless, for a historian, it's a necessary thing to do. The historian has to try to translate one into the other. How is the physical object which appears to escape the bonds of language to be made subject to its power? How can anachrony be reconciled with chronology? Constructing a period and defining the temporal, as well as the ontological value of objects, is clearly as fraught with difficulty as subscribing to the end of history. This is no easy way out. This is no easier than saying, okay, history's over, we just live in an eternal present. Periodization involves negotiating the non-synchronous nature of temporality, the need to relate multiple streams of time to one another in a narrative that does not do any one of them undue violence. So it's a balancing act. I mean, how do you try to relate one form of time to another without doing violence? I think, in some sense, Heidegger's right, that the act of interpretation is always a violent one. But nevertheless, there are some more sensitive violences than others. By introducing the present into accounts of the past, the historian finds a way to acknowledge the necessarily reductive nature of the historical enterprise. The compromise of translating multiple forms of time into a singular narrative in order to ascribe them meaning will always be subject to revision. While it seems imperative to distinguish the otherness of distinct moments in order to construct the idea of a period, be it in the past or the present, it is also necessary to admit that these distinctions are never permanent and that their differences depend upon the interests of the now. As Lydia Liu, important translation theorist in New York, points out in discussing the problem of translation in an age of globalization, the concept of difference depends on the context in which it is uttered. Whatever is different will always be motivated. Whatever we call different will always have an ideology behind it. Periodization, time's categorization, is as crucial to historical writing as the continual renegotiation of what is to count as a period's identifying characteristics. Historians find themselves in the paradoxical situation of insisting that distinctions between historical moments matter, while at the same time acknowledging that the qualities of such differences can never be fixed. What counts either as past or present may well be a fabrication, yet the distinction is there to provide a structure with which to deal with a trajectory from a shadowy past through the bright intensity of the present into a dim and unrecognized future. If we are never fully aware, however, of what it is to be contemporary, historical writing must take place in circumstances of uncertainty and even a kind of blindness. This is a perennial problem always thrown at historians, that they never understand the place in which they actually are writing from. If history inevitably betrays the nature of the present in which it is written, those who engage in it have nevertheless only an indistinct idea of the qualities of their own temporal location. The present seems to be filled both with the presence of the past and an anticipation of the future. Does it have an identity that we can call its own? Thank you. This is what comes from talking about time. Somebody's listening. Okay, try to carry on. Thank you. It is Kubler who manages to articulate the difficulty of these circumstances most effectively. And I quote him again, he's one of my favorite authors. Actuality is when the lighthouse is dark between the flashes. It is the instant between the ticks of the watch. It is a void interval slipping forever through time, the rupture between past and future. The gaps at the poles of the revolving magnetic field, infinitesimally small but ultimately real. It is the interchronic pause when nothing is happening. It is the void between events. That past time is defined in terms of present time is by now truism. but it is one whose meaning is changed if the anachronic encounter with other historical horizons, an interaction mediated through artifacts, be they images or books, is taken into consideration. Visual objects are fully historical, not only because they have not because they have been mortified and forced to become part of a lifeless epistemology. Seems to someone's agreeing with me. But precisely because they cannot be captured, frozen, or embalmed. Artifacts of all kinds, whether or not they have been accorded the privileged status of art, call forth their own interpretations. If history's clock runs on Kubler's fragments of matter, these fragments are much a part of the present as they are of the past. The idea that contemporaneity is so distinct that it cannot be placed in historical perspective seems to be a product of the darkness of actuality, the void between events, of the impossibility of discerning what is happening around us now. Whether we like it or not, however, this too shall pass, and the contemporary seems likely to be periodized and reperiodized in future contexts in ways that might seem currently unexpected and improbable. In the full realization of the difficulty of saying anything conclusive or on this elusive topic of time, let me try to bring this talk to an end. Rather than obliterate the necessity to characterize something as fleeting and ephemeral as time, an awareness of heterochronicity, time's varied significance in different cultural contexts, adds urgency to the search for ideas adequate to understanding its multiplicity. The idea that contemporaneity is a form of non-time, one in which history no longer operates, threatens to impoverish not only a sense of alterity of the past, but an appreciation of the differences between cultures. This talk therefore insists that tomorrow's time will be different from today's, not because this is dictated by any inherent characteristic, but because the need to create differences in the texture of time, because of the need to create differences in the texture of time. While such distinctions may be difficult to defend, and their perceived characteristics will depend on the perspectives of those articulating them, their ambivalence seems necessary. Time past, time present, and time future, both actual and virtual, both graspable and ungraspable, both concrete and abstract, both intelligible and unintelligible at the same time. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Moxey. I was thinking that just before I open the floor for a little time of questions and answers, whether you would agree with me that the significance of George Kubler's visionary understanding of the role and significance of the discipline of art history might have something to do with the fact that contemporary art now makes a different set of demands on the scholar. That contemporary art and what is produced under contemporary art, because it is able to live with greater comfort with heterochronicity, then also perhaps produces the condition under which historicist vanities are more difficult to sustain.
No, I think that's perfectly true. I think that we live in a world where contemporary art can be produced in many, many different locations. Of course, this is not naive. This is not so utopian that it doesn't recognize the role of the markets. The role of the markets, primarily still in Europe and the United States, tend to act as a filter on what is received there, what can sell there, how it sells. So it's still certainly there, but there's an interest, there's a fascination now with parts of the globe with artistic products of extraordinary richness and complexity produced in circumstances that were previously unimaginable.
With that, I would be very happy to take a few questions. We are running short of time, as always, but we can make some time.
También puedo intentar algunas respuestas en español si tienen la paciencia con mi lenguaje inadecuado.
Yes, Hugo. Okay, there's a kind of microphone go up right in front?
¿es posible ganar el tiempo que fue robado dentro del arte contemporáneo? A través de la producción del arte contemporáneo, ¿será posible ganar el tiempo?
La pregunta ¿es posible ganar el tiempo con el arte contemporáneo? Bueno, una pregunta muy imaginativa. No sé la respuesta, no tengo respuesta.
Bueno, Kate, gracias por tu presentación. Mira, yo quería retomar un punto que hablamos aquí y en muchos libros lo veo, y se trata de lo postcolonial. Lo postcolonial es entendido en el mundo occidental, pero no en el mundo donde ocurrió lo colonial. Me refiero a lo siguiente: si uno pasea en África y pregunta sobre postcolonial, ningún paisano responde y dice ¿qué es eso? No lo entiende, no lo vive. Es una percepción que todavía se está construyendo como concepto en Occidente, pero como realidad, su complejidad en África todavía no es asimilada, ni en las universidades, ni en las instituciones. Entonces, cuando yo veo a Okui hablar de postcolonial, de pronto digo, aguas, están hablando de una realidad desde una perspectiva occidental, pero si vamos a la tierra y vemos entre los analfabetos, que son la mayoría del continente, ellos no saben de qué se trata lo postcolonial. Tal vez lo viven como experiencia, pero todavía ninguna institución lo ha filtrado, lo ha destilado para poder compartirlo en un nivel internacional. No diría ni universal, porque lo universal, lo acabas de decir, tiene muchas dificultades. Entonces, en ese sentido, ver que la Galería Saatchi, que es una promotora de arte contemporáneo, haya abierto un banco en Internet y recibir cualquier oferta y de ahí sacar un filtro, presentar una exposición que se llama The Things to Come. En esa exposición me sorprendió ver otra vez la misma especulación. Por ejemplo, una pieza Boli, que es una figura de toro que en Mali se hace en barro y en excremento de vaca y está en los altares domésticos de todas las casas. Un artista lo toma, lo amplifica y lo presenta como arte contemporáneo, cuando para nosotros es religioso y tradicional. Entonces eso me llama la atención. Lo mismo en Venecia, un artista americano retoma una pieza que César Martínez, un mexicano, haya hecho hace mucho y lo ven como contemporáneo. Entonces, esa complejidad de lo contemporáneo, me gustaría que junto con lo postcolonial lo discutiéramos un poquito para aclararlo. Gracias.
Gracias por la pregunta, bastante complicada, pero lo que he encontrado interesante, sorprendente y también lamentable es que la idea de la poscolonialidad no es una realidad para los pueblos africanos, porque ellos lo han experienciado, they've experienced it, porque las naciones africanas solamente se liberaron de las fuerzas coloniales en el momento de la posguerra. Durante los años 50, 60 se han hecho independientes. Así que ellos viven en un estado postcolonial, pero por otra parte parece, de lo que has dicho, que no tiene mucho sentido para el pueblo en general.
Can we take a couple of more questions together and then, yeah, over there, please.
Una pregunta, ¿usted cree que la generalización de que el arte contemporáneo siempre genera una crítica que alimenta a la institución y la situación europea en crisis están generando una especie como de cambio en el tiempo de la concepción del arte contemporáneo?
Perdón, ¿lo podía repetir una vez?
Que asumir que el arte contemporáneo siempre genera una crítica que alimenta a la institución, como que de manera positiva, y eso sumado a Europa actualmente en crisis y Europa como eje de la conceptualización del arte contemporáneo, están generando una especie de cambio, o sea, uno de los motores para cambiar, para destruir el tiempo del arte contemporáneo.
Bueno, es interesante pensar que el arte tenga este poder de cambiar las ideas, si te he entendido bien, que esta crisis de una crisis política, quizás europea, tenga algo que ver con el arte contemporáneo. ¿Fue esa la pregunta?
No, más bien como en la ontología del arte contemporáneo, en lo que se discute dentro de la academia y asumiéndolo como un ejercicio de crítica, es decir, que la crítica que genera el arte contemporáneo ya no sea válida o ni siquiera considerable de pensar. O sea, muchas de las cosas que pasan en Inglaterra, por ejemplo, son demasiado irónicas.
Bueno, no, quizás lo he entendido esta vez, que tiene algo que ver con la crítica del arte. Es verdad que hay una crisis de la crítica del arte, que la crítica no tiene el rol que tendría en el momento momento modernista. La crítica fue increíblemente importante, como un tal Greenberg, por ejemplo. Los artistas leían lo que decía y hacían lo que él quería. Los artistas no tienen mucho que ver con la crítica, y los críticos no juegan un gran rol, me parece. Que el mercado ahora dicta, es el mercado que dicta lo que va a suceder y cuáles son las formas de arte que van a that are going to win and which are not going to win.
¿Sí? Yo me gustaría que te pudieras extenderte un poco más en las implicaciones políticas, es decir, de decisión en el presente.
No veo quién están hablando.
Yo.
Perdón,
hasta atrás.
Atrás.
Arriba.
Puedes.
Esto.
Sí.
Hola.
Ok, hola.
Sí, me pareció un poco complicado entender por qué la propuesta de Bourdieu no es la de Fukuyama y cómo en tu construcción estableces una especie de identidad, que es lo que yo creo que tiene, que no hay una identidad, creo que es lo que tiene una serie de implicaciones políticas para el presente, entre teleología, narrativa, tiempo y cronología. No creo que haya una identidad necesaria entre esas cuatro instancias. Entonces no sé cómo tú entiendes o descifras ese posicionamiento político que tú estás haciendo de manera implícita.
Bueno, yo diría que hay política en todas nuestras teorías sobre el tiempo. El tiempo es algo muy maleable. Nadie verdaderamente sabe. El pobre San Agustín, en sus confesiones, tiene una charla con Dios y le dice a Dios, ¿qué es el tiempo? Cuando me preguntan lo que es el tiempo, me parece que tengo la respuesta. Pero cuando me pongo a decir algo sobre el tiempo, me quedo mudo. Y me parece que la política del tiempo lineal, por ejemplo, la política del tiempo del cristianismo, del tiempo del Hegel, por ejemplo, un tiempo que tiene que ver con evolución, con progreso, es claramente ideológico. Y yo diría que no es posible escapar de estas ideologías cuando uno está teorizando sobre el tiempo. Otra vez llegando a Fukuyama y a Bourdieu, Fukuyama tiene, la tesis fue que la historia se había completado con el suceso del capitalismo, etcétera, etcétera. Pero con Bourdieu es otra cosa. Bourdieu es muy sensitivo, muy sensitivo, tiene gran sensatez con la multiplicidad de los tiempos, que los tiempos se desarrollan a distintas velocidades. Él sabe eso y quiere salir de las ideologías del tiempo lineal. Y por eso dice que hemos llegado al fin del tiempo, que lo contemporáneo es lo último, no podemos escapar, porque si tratamos de periodizar la contemporaneidad, estamos cayendo en la trampa del historicismo de los tiempos lineales.
I have time for one more question. Over there, right in the middle, yes.
Mi pregunta sería, y tiene relación con lo que estaba preguntando Isaac, si ahorita Europa está atravesando una crisis económica y que obviamente va a golpear al mercado del arte, entonces tiene que haber una especie de pausa, por decirlo de alguna manera, en el tiempo del arte contemporáneo, que sería como una especie de pausa que las demás como entidades podrían como aprovechar, porque al final de cuentas los que no están dentro de ese tiempo casi siempre están en crisis. Entonces es como más fácil trabajar en ese sentido porque no hay una especie o sea, después de la crisis sigue existiendo las cosas y sigue habiendo lo que hay. Entonces es como un momento para que ahí se gane el otro tiempo, el otro tiempo de los otros lugares.
No, sería lindo creer que esto sería el resultado de la crisis europea, pero esta relación entre la economía y el arte es muy complicada, muy complicada. Hay muchas teorías que han tratado de relacionarlo, pero no con mucho suceso.
There's a lady right here.
Con respecto de lo que se habla del tiempo, a mí me gustaría enfatizar que cuando nos centramos en la mirada europea, giramos en torno a una mirada distinta de lo que sucede en otras partes del mundo. Y yo quiero poner como ejemplo el caso de Vietnam, en donde tuve la oportunidad de vivir en el año 1989-90, donde se llevó a cabo todo un proceso de reconciliación nacional y esto llevó a una serie de pautas que permitieron que el país se refundara a partir de su reunificación, pero también cimentara nuevas estructuras a partir de su cultura y ahora es un país considerado un milagro dentro de la economía mundial por todos las pautas que instrumentaron, pero también eso repercute en su arte contemporáneo. Un arte contemporáneo que difícilmente vemos, por ejemplo, en México, porque estamos con la mirada puesta en Europa o puesta en Estados Unidos. Entonces me parece que esos tiempos también son muy distintos de los tiempos que puede suceder en el arte contemporáneo indígena o en el arte contemporáneo de África, por ejemplo.
Very briefly, Eri, and then we can...
Mire, yo quisiera agregar a esas dos últimas intervenciones los nuevos exotismos. Y ahí, Shuddha, quisiera que también respondieras en eso. En el Pompidou presentaron una exposición que se llamó París, Bombay, Delhi, en donde etnologizaron. Hablando de etnología, hay que hablar del presente etnográfico que Sally Price mencionó en su libro, cuando las obras de civilizaciones primitivas entran en museos del primer mundo. Esas conversiones, esas especulaciones que ahorita están sucediendo, se prestan a que Europa busque un menú mucho más exótico, sea en Asia, en África, en India, donde sea, y presente ese nuevo plato en sus instituciones con algunos tintes todavía peyorativos, si lo puedo decir de esta manera. Entonces quisiera saber cuáles son las respuestas que nosotros, implicados en este proceso, podemos dar a esa situación. Quien haya visto Venecia últimamente o todo lo que se está presentando, se da cuenta que hay una crisis, pero esa crisis no debe permear una nueva especulación llena de prejuicios. Gracias.
Well, it's not my job to be speaking today, but I'll address your question, and I will do that by also posing a kind of concluding question to Professor Moxey. I know I've followed very keenly your writing on Renaissance painting, and I think that you make a very interesting observation today, which is that artists break time. And in that sense, this breakage of time, or the overflowing of the contents of the box of time that artists do is not something without its precedent. It has been done before, happens in every culture, and crucially this relationship, and here I'm now coming to Eri, is often a result of the transaction between those who make the work, those who look at the work, and those who think about the work. Those who make the work sometimes reconfigure the temporal, spatial, conceptual conditions under which that work is seen. I agree with you that the exhibition at the Pompidou Center represented once again the inability of metropolitan France to be able to deal with the complexity of the world that has grown around it. For me, it was a bit of time travel because the exhibition seemed to be somewhere between 1967 and 1972, whereas many of the artworks were in 2012. Now that, for me, is an occasion and an opportunity for us to insist on the fact that some or many of the artists in the exhibition, including ourselves, Rux Media Collective, were taking the responsibility of breaking the temporal framework of that exhibition. So in that sense, we were revealing, as we say, exposing the inner contradictions of the temporal vanity of a certain quarter of Paris, which is not even France. Thank you.
I have nothing much to add except that ethnological time, anthropological time, is in crisis itself. As you know, in the late 80s, James Clifford and a number of important theoretical anthropologists concluded that anthropology had been based on a European perspective, that anthropology was a way of enacting the 18th century encyclopedia. You sit at home in Paris and you look at the rest of the world. So, I mean, that model seems to ride on into the future without ever coming to an end.
And whenever it happens, I think it reveals, I mean, my question now is, who is the exotic other? The exhibition proposes, in my view, that the Pompidou Center itself is performing the exotic other. We are looking at that performance.
Yeah, very good.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Professor.
Thank you.